Welcome and greetings to our webinar on radiation. We acknowledge the people of Ukraine. May this immoral war be over soon. We hope the same for all people. Thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate your wisdom in doing so. My name is Catherine Skopik. I'm chair of the New York City group of the oldest, largest grassroots environmental organization in the United States, Sierra Club, and chair of its sustainability series. This one being presented by its New York Metropolitan Region Fossil-Free, Nuclear-Free Committee. Both these industries, fossil and nuclear, are included in the committee because one, they both block renewable energy. Two, they both receive government subsidies. Three, facilities of both industries are frequently owned by the same company like Exelon. And four, both cause harm to human health and the environment. So we need to decrease both as much as possible. They are different in that we can see coal, smell gas, change the oil in our car or homes. We can't see, smell, or touch radiation. It is invisible, deadly. Complicated, expensive science and means of measurement are needed to identify the type, level, and amount. Not exactly common knowledge. But we can learn how and where radiation exists, how we can avoid and prevent it to protect the health of others and ourselves, why we're here. There are many aspects to radiation: environmental and racial justice, climate, homeland security, geopolitical, economic, and more. But this evening, we are addressing mainly radiation. Other related topics may be discussed in future webinars. Our audience varies from novice to longtime expert. Ask questions at the end of the speakers' presentations. Type one at a time briefly in the chat. We'll answer briefly as many as we can. We have three speakers: Barbara Arundel, Director of Damascus Citizens for Sustainability; Cindy Folkers of Beyond Nuclear; and Michelle Lee, New York attorney with the Council on Intelligent Energy and Conservation Policy, CIECP, Promoting Health and Sustainable Energy, PHASE, the Nuclear Information Resource Service, NIRS, and Nuclear Consulting Group, NCG, an international interdisciplinary think tank. And now Michelle, one of our speakers, will introduce Barbara Arundel of Damascus Citizens for Sustainability. Michelle?
My great pleasure. So Barbara is the director of the Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, DCS, as well as its chief science officer. DCS launched in 2008 and led the wake-up call to the East Coast on the dangers of fracking. The Academy Award nominee documentary Grassland 2010, which I'm sure we all remember from the water bursting into flame, is dedicated to DCS by its director and filmmaker, Josh Fox. DCS was a major influence in the 2014 banning of fracking in New York State. More recently, Barbara shared with Justin Nobel a panoply of documents and potential interviewees for his eye-opening January 2020 Rolling Stone article titled America's Radioactive Secret. DCS, working with allies, achieved a Delaware River Basin frack drilling ban in 2021. And Barbara continues to educate the public, national and international press, and policymakers about fracking, its impacts, and the political and science response underlying it. Fracking, of course, produces radiation, which is unseen. And Barbara will introduce us to some of the politics and hazards of radioactive frack waste. which is euphemistically called brine. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I just want to say also that Damascus in our name is the hometown of many of our founders. That's where the Damascus and Damascus Citizens for Sustainability came from. We didn't know there was going to be a war in Syria, so here we are. It's just home. I have to mention here at the beginning that the DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission, a compact of the 4 basin states and the federal government, has proposed regulations that would allow import of gas and oil drilling waste to the Delaware River Basin, where there is a ban of actual frack drilling. We, and hopefully you will join us to fight that waste import. In this first slide, note the gray seal layer on the slide. When the very high pressures are applied in hydraulic fracturing, this layer is often turned to rubble with the surrounding areas, which are also turned to rubble by the fracturing. This leads to the movement of gas to the aquifer layers and to the surface via connections to natural and induced faults and fractures. Hydraulic fracturing is, the purpose of it is to induce fractures. When a gas well is fracked, gas and fluids gush up the well and to the surface, not only from the extreme pressures needed to accomplish hydraulic fracturing, but also because the formation is what's called overpressured, meaning that it has its own pressure pushing out from that layer. This pressure, higher than the surrounding layers, is why the wastewater continues to surface and cannot be stopped. Called flowback and other names, it contains water, many chemicals, and the deep geology pollutants that are released from the buried shale formations. Over 94% of all gas and oil wells are fracked, so there is essentially no difference between conventional and unconventional gas and oil wells. They cause the same damage. It is well known and long understood that the Marcellus and other shale formations are highly radioactive. That radioactivity is one of the markers used to locate the oil and gas formation layer. The naturally occurring radioactive material called NORM, by its abbreviation, are not a health hazard when buried a mile down, but are highly dangerous when they are brought to the surface. There is no way to avoid these pollutants, making wastewater from shale drilling inevitably contaminated with radioactivity. Other wastes and the gas stream itself are also carrying radioactivity. Exposure to these radioactive materials by the public is occurring, increasing the likelihood of cancers and other health impacts. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years, so it will be present in the environment for thousands of years. It degrades to radon, emitting highly bioactive radioactive particles. The dangers of radon are well known, but it is more than radon. Radioactivity is measured by concentration, radioactivity intensity, biological impact, and/or amount absorbed. The amount and type of energy emitted by particle release is expressed by it being alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. To avoid confusion, I'm going to just talk about picocuries, a radioactivity intensity measurement, but you will see these other types of measurements if you look into this further. Lower numbers are best. For example, the EPA maximum contaminant level for radium in drinking water is 5 picocuries per liter. The flowback, also called, quote, brine, unquote, because of its high salt content and in an effort to hide its toxic components, can be highly radioactive, as concentrated as 15,000 picocuries per liter. And each time the water is reused at another fracked gas or oil well, which they do, more radium, uranium, strontium, and other radioactive materials are accumulated from the oil and gas layers. These materials are metals, actually, are more easily dissolved in high salt, so are carried in the salty wastewater. Okay, we're up to slide 2. Once the materials, a little more, yeah, okay. Once the materials move from the formation layer, it becomes T-norm, or technically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive materials, which should be governed by additional rules related to T-norm, but it's not, because the waste is mostly exempt from protective regulations via 1980s and 2005 arrangements favoring the fossil fuel industry over human and environmental health. These exemptions are also subsidies. The exemptions can be overcome by state or regional authorities like the DRBC. The DRBC can and must ban the import, treatment, and any sort of disposal of fracking wastewater in the basin. Oh, in order to avoid import of radioactive toxic waste. If this import happens, there will be damage to environmental and human health and even the economic health of the Delaware Basin. States so far have not been willing to put in place effective replacements for these exempted protective federal laws. The DRBC must do so. A Duke University study of a stream in Pennsylvania below a fracked wastewater treatment plant found radium-226 levels in stream sediments at the point of discharge were about 200 times greater than upstream sediments and background sediments, and above low-level reactive waste, low-level radioactive waste disposal thresholds. Government does not properly regulate frack wastewater containing T-norm, and there is no indication in prior draft gas regulations that the DRBC is planning to tackle the problem of radioactivity in the wastewater imports. The concentrated residuals that are filtered from wastewater at the treatment plants can occur at levels that are so dangerous they would need to be removed to a specially designed storage facility, such as those used for nuclear waste. But that kind of special handling would need to be built into the regulation of the residuals as hazardous waste, which is not happening nor being proposed. So what's in the waste? Slide 3, please. Okay, can we, yeah, there we go. Okay, a little more. That's it. This slide, which we actually first did in 2008, but is still applicable, and the following one gives you some idea of the complex soup of toxic and radioactive materials introduced and released from gas and oil wells. Some of the over 1,000 chemicals detected are in these spreadsheets compiled by researchers. So let's go to slide 4. Slide 4 is part of the endocrine disruption exchange's compilation of chemicals used in natural gas development and delivery, which totaled over 1,000 items, which in this case all came from Colorado materials in 2008, but many areas are very similar. And if you want to see these spreadsheets, just contact DCS and we can send them to you. In addition, the lack of analysis at well sites and related lack of truck signage or placarding that would accurately reflect the level of toxicity and radioactivity of transported wastewater adds additional risk to the movement of radioactive wastewater by truck or pipeline. Plus, there is the present inevitability of transport accidents and deliberate illegal dumping. We insist that this dangerous waste not be imported and not be released anywhere. This slide includes radioactive materials, but not the amounts of radioactivity they incorporate or their health effects. Our following two presenters will cover more of the radioactivity health effects. It is important to keep in mind that no matter the source of the radioactivity, the health effects are the same. Additionally, it is just being understood how very low doses of many chemicals act as hormones in living beings, disrupting function and causing sickness. Also, when there are mixtures of low doses of chemicals, the effect is a multiplying of the individual impacts. So let's go on to the last slide, slide 5. This final slide has our website, which I hope you will visit. And I want to direct everyone to the newly released, very comprehensive 8th edition of the Compendium on Concerned Health Professionals of New York's website, which is concernedhealthyny.org. It is a compendium of scientific, medical, and media findings demonstrating risks and harms of fracking and associated gas and oil infrastructure. It is very worth looking at. It is very comprehensive, and it is searchable. So on to the next.
Thank you, Michelle, for your introduction. And thank you, Barbara, for that wonderful fact-filled presentation. And I believe it alerts us to the fact that we still do have to worry about fracking. There is sometimes this sense in New York say, oh, it's done. We banned fracking. We nothing else to worry about. Nothing to see here, folks. So with your information and your presentation, you really let us know that we do have to watch out for this. And in the Delaware River Basin, which Sierra Club is beginning to look at as well, with some other individuals who want to make it a national park. This is very important information, Barbara. It's wonderful of you to have given us this presentation. Thank you so much. And now we're going to be moving to, as Barbara said, health and radiation. And we will hear from expert Cindy Folkers. And Cindy, ever since joining Beyond Nuclear in 2007, focused on ionizing radiation and its impact on health and the environment from both scientific and historical perspective. She advocates for fully protecting the health of females, lucky for us, and all early life stages in the face of uncertain health outcomes. Cynthia earned an MS in environmental studies, environmental science from Johns Hopkins University. Thank you, Cindy, so much for being here and to share your expertise with us. The floor is yours.
Sure. Let me just make sure I can share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I'm going to share some basic knowledge of radiation's impact on health. There are a number of different types of radiation. I will be talking exclusively about ionizing radiation. And I contend that understanding radiation's impact on health has been difficult, not because it is full of uncertainties, which it is, but because radiation science has been plagued with poor assumptions and incomplete damage models. It has failed to follow the obvious and critical questions needed to help us understand and deal with these uncertainties, particularly damage to the most susceptible. Of course, some radioactivity is naturally occurring, but humans concentrate this radioactivity through mining and use of oil, gas, and uranium fuels. They create new radioactive isotopes never before seen in nature by a number of industrial processes, and they do this in order to produce electricity from nuclear reactors and also to produce atomic weaponry. Further, humans release these radioisotopes to the environment through processes like mining, milling, and enrichment of uranium, fabrication of uranium fuels, and fissioning of those reactor fuel rods. And I would point out one more industrial process, which is reprocessing. That's the chemical separation of uranium and plutonium contained in irradiated reactor fuel that has been removed from the core. You then have to store the highly radioactive used up fuel or radioactive waste, some of which can last for thousands of years. And all along this process, wastes are released and environments are contaminated and people are exposed. So for an accessible explanation of the uranium fuel chain, please see Beyond Nuclear's handbook pictured here. The link is included on the slide at the end of this presentation, which contains a list of references. So let's go through some technical basics first. Ionizing radiation is expelled from the nucleus of an unstable or radioactive atom. This expulsion, known as decay, is represented by a unit called a becquerel. The 1 becquerel is equal to 1 atomic disintegration per second. Different radionuclides have different numbers of decay per second and give off different kinds of radiation. Each type of radiation can be stopped or travel through different types of material depending on the density of the material and the quality of the radiation itself. The first 2 types of radiation here, alpha and beta particles, for instance, are less damaging outside our bodies, where they can be blocked by paper or aluminum. But they become more damaging if the isotope that is ejecting them is inhaled or ingested, since there's nothing inside our cells like paper or aluminum to block their energy. In this case, each one of these disintegrations or hits, represented by a becquerel, may cause damage and disease. So when we think of radioactive releases from nuclear reactors, we often think of catastrophic releases like Chernobyl or Fukushima. But reactors have huge unplanned releases, which are not the result of a meltdown. And they can continue to operate after these releases. For instance, in 1979, Oyster Creek in New Jersey released 1 million curies, which is a large release, but it wasn't termed a disaster. And then there are the releases that are allowed that fit in with the official idea of a permissible dose. But permissible does not mean safe. And we know this because this dose was originally called an acceptable injury limit. Radionuclides released from these different types of circumstances can be different. With this in mind, this slide offers both a partial list of radionuclides released from a catastrophic meltdown, this would be Chernobyl, and also a partial list of radionuclides released routinely. I also include here nuclides like uranium because civilian reactors use uranium as fuel, and uranium is almost always on lands of First Nations or those who live close to the land. So it is important to weave uranium and its impact into any presentation on the health dangers of nuclear power. The orange arrows designate the radionuclides we often focus on to determine health outcomes from exposures, but these are not the only ones of concern, however. For instance, this blue arrow points to xenon-133, which is fat-loving and could actually be responsible for a substantial dose during the first days of a catastrophic release. And please note that radium and radon are starred because they and their decay products can be relevant to health impacts of oil and gas technology. 4 main things can happen to a single cell once it's hit by any type of ionizing radiation. The cell can be undamaged or damaged and properly repair itself. The cell can be so damaged that it dies. The cell can be damaged, improperly repair, live and reproduce, but the daughter cells die. Or the cell can look repaired, but hold mutations that it passes on to the daughter cells, which in turn are mutated and survive. For lower doses especially, this is the important process because it can result in diseases that can show up in humans and other animals decades or even generations after the initial damage. And how much damage a hit by radiation will cause is variable due to many factors, including the age of the person, the difference between people's ability to repair themselves, the difference between certain types of cells, the type of radiation, and the type of exposure. So there are many different types of cells within the individual that perform specific functions. For instance, brain cells, they're different from nerve cells, which are different from heart muscle cells, and so on. Some cells, like bone marrow cells, are more sensitive to radiation than other cells. Finally, studies show that children, women, and pregnancy are more susceptible to the effects of radiation. That means they're more likely to get disease from exposure to it than the male standard used as the basis for our radiation exposure standards. And these impacts are my focus. To that end, let's look at where the radioisotopes that were listed previously travel and collect in a pregnant body. I should note that xenon 133 is not included in this list, but remember, it's fat loving, so it will go to fat cells. What I would point out from this graphic is the collection in the fetus of nearly every radionuclide on this list. And do note, radioactive carbon and radioactive hydrogen, called tritium, can collect in fetal tissue at twice the concentration as they do in maternal tissue. They are the basic building blocks of the human body, as is calcium, which is mimicked by radioactive strontium, which is a bone seeker that lodges in the mineral bone of growing skeletons and likely will not leave the body for most of that person's life. So, how can we determine how damaging a specific radioisotope is for any given organ? Well, we need to convert from how radioactive something is in becquerel to the kind of damage that it causes in a unit called sieverts. And this is the formula that supposedly does that. Now, this is their basic attempt to calculate and to help us understand how much and what kind of biological damage comes from exposure to different kinds of radioisotopes and the kind of radiation they give off. This formula encompasses individual nuclides that are deposited in the body. So this formula would be for an internal dose. There are also biokinetic models describing basically where in the body the radionuclide goes and when or if it leaves. But the basis for these models has mostly been higher doses and mostly representative of a male adult. For low dose dosimetry and chronic exposure, these models are lacking because they are avoiding the intricacies and individualities of a fully functioning human system. For instance, children are represented as little adults, and damage to children's organs is almost based exclusively on weight, not function or dysfunction over time. Adults are represented as slabs of meat. That's my characterization because these models are not reflecting the complexities of the damage, such as cumulative damage by continuing exposure. That's not accounted for. Neither are the metabolic or hormone pathways, particularly the estrogenic pathway, which seems susceptible to action by ionizing radiation. Biokinetic models are not sex specific. A male model is still used for females, and they are also not age dependent. In general, these formulas represent transport systems, but there are many more systems in our bodies, one of which is the reproductive system. So basically, research studies use a dose to a non-pregnant uterus to determine pregnancy damage. Damage to a number of processes during pregnancy are either poorly accounted for or not accounted for at all, such as damage to sites in stem cells responsible for blood cell formation, the maternal exchange system, and damage to embryo organ tissues and placental function. Although they are in the process of correcting for some of these shortcomings, we unfortunately have a whole body of studies that have made poor assumptions about dose impacts, particularly from recurring lower doses. And unfortunately, these studies have scooped the narrative about what the damage is or is expected to be without coming clean on the depth and the importance of the uncertainties. So there are a lot of uncertainties and poor assumptions used for formulas for dose reconstruction and representation of damage. The mantra of the mostly harmless low dose, along with other really poor assumptions, are routinely used to dismiss radiation's damage, leaving no identified explanation often for the studies that find disease increases, when in reality, radiation could be responsible. So official studies of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima all suffer from poor assumptions. Underlying all of this uncertainty is how low is a low dose. So this is an autoradiograph of a plutonium particle in the lung. Now, determining what is a low dose is an epistemic problem that extends well beyond plutonium, but I'm using plutonium as an example. And this is particularly important for radionuclides that are internally deposited. So you can get a very small dose when you divide this plutonium particle dose among all of the lung tissue. But as you can see by the starlight deposition of the energy, the dose isn't being delivered to the entire lung. So what is this dose? Well, there is research and publication that's currently examining this. This 40 micron region around the particle is about 2/5 as wide as a strand of hair. And the dose per day that this cell is getting is 1,000 to 10,000 gray. For a comparison, a whole body dose delivered to a human being of 1,000 gray causes almost immediate unconsciousness and death within an hour. So clearly that means death for this cell. But what we also know is that the cells surrounding the cell can also be affected by the dose, even though they were not directly exposed. That's a phenomenon called the bystander effect. So again, I ask, how low is low? And what happens with a radionuclide like strontium, which we talked about before, which is a bone seeker, which goes into a growing skeleton and doesn't leave for most of that person's life. That's why it's important that we know what the studies are actually showing. So continuing exposure to radiation levels at or near natural background doses are associated with increases in childhood cancer, primarily leukemia, but also central nervous system cancers. You can see that represented here on this slide by these two graphs. For reference, naturally occurring background radiation exposure is an average of 80 to 100 millirem per year. And note that the 225 nanosieverts per hour is about 197 millirem per year, which at which the exposed individual would have twice the chance of developing the disease. These dose levels are also associated with subclinical impacts leading to behavioral problems and underperformance in school, particularly in math. Dozens of studies show increases of childhood leukemia around normally operating nuclear facilities, particularly in children under 5 years of age. There were increases of childhood leukemia in children who resided within 5 kilometers downwind of the Kreml boiling water reactor in Germany, represented here by this map. Following this study and others like it, the German government funded a countrywide study which showed that children under 5 years of age living within 5 kilometers of reactors in Germany had elevated rates of leukemia. A cascade of studies followed in other European countries showing much the same result, and you can see this data pooled here in this table, which was compiled by Alfred Körblein and Ian Fairley in Europe. We have independent studies in the US showing increases in disease as well, but we have yet to have an official US-wide study undertaken on this critical issue of childhood cancers around nuclear facilities. The most recent study on perinatal mortality in Japan following the Fukushima meltdown and explosion in March 2011 shows that during 2012 to 2019 time period, there were 590 excess perinatal deaths in the area shown here in both dark and light gray. Further, there were, quote, massive increases in 2018 and 2019 in the 4 core prefectures, end quote. Those are represented here on the map in dark gray, meaning the issue continues past the initial plume exposures and could point to ongoing radioactive contamination as partly responsible. The study recommends, quote, continued investigation of perinatal mortality in contaminated regions of Japan. After living with Chernobyl contamination for decades, studies indicate radiation damage may be carried and compounded across generations, and a recent study in the Bryansk region of Russia, inside the green circle, associates birth defects with living in contaminated areas. Some of these birth defects are de novo, meaning that they are appearing in this population for the first time. Further, study projections indicate that certain birth defects will continue to increase in the next few years. But it's not just radioactivity from nuclear sites. Complex environmental exposures from a variety of sources such as chemicals, infectious agents, and lifestyle factors, and how they can affect a person's health is called the exposome. The study by Korsakov that I mentioned on the last slide in the Bryansk region of Russia, uniquely, also examined and demonstrated additive and potentially synergistic impacts in areas contaminated by Chernobyl radioactivity and industrial chemicals both. Exposome investigations need to lead the way into further research on radiation damage, as do what I call biomarker studies that I did not mention here. Biomarker studies look at the traces radiation leaves in our cells to determine the damage. And that's the end of my presentation. I will be happy to take any questions, and this is a list of resources that I used to compile my talk. Thank you.
Amazing, Cindy. Just totally amazing. There's so much information there to learn and hear. I am uplifted to know that we can be so specific about how these various radioactive particles are affecting the body in different parts of the body. Thank you so very much. That was excellent. And now our third and last speaker is Michelle Lee, with whom I've worked on anti-nuclear events, the 2018 Earth Day event in Battery Park, New York City, 3 other educational nuclear webinars, and more. Michelle, an attorney, works in New York with the Council on Intelligent Energy and Conservation Policy, CIECP, Promoting Health and Sustainable Energy, or PHASE, PHASE. And she serves on the board of the Nuclear Information and Resource Services, NIRS. And Tim, the director, has been here in New York and worked with many of us many times. And NIRS is an industry watchdog organization based in the Washington, D.C. area. The website, I can put it in the chat, www.nirs.org. And Michelle, as if she didn't have enough organizations to work on, is also a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group, or NCG, which is an international interdisciplinary think tank. Thank you, Michelle, for being here, for being a speaker for us, and for sharing some of your very wide, broad experience over the years and with all the various organizations. Thank you, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So just for in a minute before we go to my slides, which Catherine is generously going to put up for me, I just want to frame this whole area, both with fracking and use of nuclear power. And I always start with just asking the following question, which is, what kind of world do we want? Because I think we get very tied up sometimes trying to figure out, oh, we have to, get this much energy for this reason, or accomplish something, or we're worried about terrorism, or we're worried about this, and then, for 5 minutes we're worried about 9/11, and then the BP oil thing happens, and we're worried about oil going into ocean, and that lasts for 5 minutes, and we have Katrina, we're worried about, something like Katrina. Now we're focused on what's going on with high oil and gas prices. But a lot of these dangers and hazards we're facing aren't really necessarily what we want to continue with. And it's really not being imposed externally by some force of nature. These are human decisions. And as we address the various problems, climate change, health, geopolitical confrontations, and so forth, I think we have to think very carefully about what do we really need. And I also would ask people to reflect upon their experience during the COVID shutdowns. I don't think there were too many people that were missing going out and just buying lots of stuff, right? People were missing human engagement. We were missing going and being with friends and family. We were missing going out to a cafe and having, an espresso, meeting friends for lunch. And if we're talking about quality of life and thriving as a species and keeping our planet habitable, which I think we all would agree are our highest priorities, we also have to realize that some of what we think of as necessary really isn't contributing to our overall well-being. And so with that little prelude, can we go into the slides?
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. The title page, shall I go to the next?
Yeah, you can go.
Okay.
So I think we were going to go to 5. Right. Yeah, so even though we're not really focusing on climate change overall, I just want to point out that the major argument of the hour, and it used to be nuclear is so cheap, and then when it turned out to be really, really expensive, it's now switching to suddenly it's the answer to climate change, right? Well, in fact, it's an accelerant of climate change. And there's several reasons for this, but One is that if you go through the full fuel cycle, which we'll look at in a second, every single aspect of the full fuel cycle involves heavy use of fossil fuels. Nuclear is really a very heavy industrial process. And what's important to remember with greenhouse gases, as opposed to other kinds of pollutants, the pollution caused by greenhouse gases and the warming of our planet doesn't really relate to a specific area. It relates to the totality of greenhouse gas emissions that go up into the atmosphere, right? So unlike, for instance, mercury poisoning from a coal plant, which would be concentrated in a specific area, or even the health impacts of radioactivity from a nuclear power plant, that would be concentrated in an area. Greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't really matter where they come from. So when you're doing an analysis of what kinds of forms of energy we want to be using now and in the future, you have to look at something called the full fuel cycle, which is the totality of all the greenhouse gas emissions that is produced through all of the different processes that are needed for the particular form of generation. And by the way, this applies to renewables and efficiency as well, because renewables have a greenhouse gas footprint, and efficiency, creating products that make things more efficient, also have a greenhouse gas footprint. But in fact, the nuclear footprint is pretty high. And can we go to the next slide? Or actually, that's number 3. Okay, so this is, I don't know if you can make that a little bigger, but it's not anyway. This is just an image of all the different things that go into the whole full cycle, going from the uranium mining, milling, enrichment, the building of these huge installations, which uses a lot of concrete and steel, which are very heavy greenhouse gas to produce those materials, and then going through the full waste cycle and the ultimate disposition of not just the high level nuclear waste, for which we haven't figured out, have no idea what to do with really, but also like just tons and tons of what are euphemistically called low level waste. And for instance, one thing about nuclear power, unlike other forms of generation, once you've built these things and you have all these materials, a lot of them become radioactive. In fact, even the clothing worn by workers during many of the activities in a nuclear power plant, their shoes, the tools they use, the equipment, becomes part of the nuclear waste stream, because they become either contaminated, or in the case of things such as concrete and many metals, the processes of fission actually make those materials radioactive on their own. It's sort of one of these sort of sci-fi aspects to nuclear that's unique to the process. And I came into this area through Indian Point. And originally, it was basically because of 9/11, and which is how a lot of people in the New York metropolitan region became woke to the issues with nuclear. And so I was originally very focused on the terrorism aspects, because in fact, Indian Point was not only identified by many, many experts after 9/11 as a key terrorist target, but the 9/11 Commission, in its investigation, found that the Al-Qaeda had actually considered changing one of the planes to go into Indian Point rather than one of the World Trade Center towers. And that was because Mohammed Atta, during his surveillance flights in the Hudson, saw Indian Point and brought it up as like, hey, why don't we do that one? But they stuck with the World Trade Center. But pretty soon after there began to be a lot of public opposition to the plant, which was going to be relicensed for another 20 years, a lot of the communities in the near vicinity of the plant and the public officials started to become also concerned about the radiation that was produced by the plant and about the public health issues. And the county of Westchester, where the plant was sited, sponsored some studies. I just want to read you the results of one paper that was published called Public Health Risks of Extending Licenses of the Indian Point 2 and 3 Nuclear Reactors. And this was authored by Joe Mangano, who's the director of the Radiation and Public Health Project. And advisors to the project were Rosalie Bertel, who's the founder of the International Institute of Concern for Public Health, Dr. Marcy Culler, Georgia State University, Dr. Samuel Epstein, Professor Emeritus of Public Health of Illinois, Chicago, Sam Galweski, Professor of Biology, Millikan University, Donald Luria, New Jersey Medical School, Kilburn, and so forth. And the point here is that this wasn't just some crackpot coming up with an analysis. This was an analysis done that looked at the data that was taken from the CDC cancer mortality data and the New York State Cancer Registry cancer incidence data of the 4 counties surrounding Indian Point. And he looked particularly and crunched the numbers of the communities within 20 miles of Indian Point. What did he find? Found childhood cancer incidence in the area was among the highest in New York State. It exceeded the US rate by 22%. Thyroid cancer incidence, 70% above the US rate. Breast cancer incidence, local area exceeded that of the state and the nation, with the excess growing over time. And incidence of the 4 most common cancers in the 6 towns within 5 miles of Indian Point in Rockland and Westchester counties at 20% greater than the rest of Rockland and Westchester counties. There was also an analysis done of strontium-90 in local baby teeth and found out that children born in the 1990s, so that would have been after Indian Point had been operating not quite for 20 years, had an average of strontium-90 level, and that's, if you remember from Cindy, that's a strontium-90 is a bone seeker, so it goes into the bones and into teeth. 38% higher than those that were born a decade earlier. So and by the way, the statistical link between strontium-90 and childhood cancer is very well established. So what was really key about this study is that it was issued right as Atomic Safety Licensing Board hearings on the relicensing of Indian Point were starting. It was released in 2007, and I was involved in those hearings. And even though Entergy, which was the operator of Indian Point, had billions of dollars in profit at stake, at that point, Indian Point was its #1 moneymaker, and nuclear was still considered competitive because renewables hadn't quite gotten up to snuff yet. So even though it had so much at stake, it did not refute the study at all. It threw a lot of mud at the authors, but did nothing to refute the study. And I can tell you as an attorney, that's one of the red flags that I always look for. You have huge companies, huge industries that have a lot of money that they can refute something with, and they have any grounds to do so, they will. All right, so quickly. let's go through the other slides. Let's go to 2, Catherine.
Okay. Wow, I wish I could get it bigger. Why is it so small?
It's you did see. Okay.
Yeah, I could try and change it, but I don't want to lose anything. Do you want me to
Okay, that's all right. We're just
Okay.
talking. You can tell from the visual. So this is a infrared photo that was taken of the thermal plume. Indian Point, the thermal plume coming from the upper right was Indian Point when it was still operating. So what's important about this thermal plume? 2 things. One, even though the thermal, which is heat, is caused, of course, by the radioactivity, which gives off heat, but it sort of gives you a visual impression of the kind of radioactivity that is pumped out every second of operation by nuclear power reactors into waterways, and also the heat, which is destroying waters. And the other thing about heat is it creates algae blooms. And so when you're looking at, and this just goes back to the issue of climate change, one of the key problems with climate change, of course, is the fact that we have warming waters. The last thing you want to do is use a form of energy production that is the #1 greatest heating stressor of waters, and that is nuclear, even though coal also creates thin plumes, and so do gas plants. But nuclear has the equivalent, effectively with Indian Point when it was operating, of essentially detonating a Hiroshima bomb from a heat point of view inside the Hudson River every day. So that's a lot of heat, right? Okay, so going to the next slide.
Okay, next you want number 4.
Yeah, sure. So that's it. We're just going to go quickly there. This is just a Nuclear Regulatory Commission map of the United States, and the big red circles, which I guess on this are little red circles, just show you the amount of spent fuel, high-level nuclear waste, right now being held at nuclear power sites all around the country. And it really gives you just a visual idea of what kind of highly radioactive material inventory we are building up. So just next slide.
Okay, is 6. You want 6?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, so this is just from the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. Their key talking points of why nuclear is not the answer to climate change, but let's go on.
Okay, do you want me to go back and
Yes.
show the plume again? Just so they see a quick glimpse of the plume? Now that I have it bigger, do you want me to just go back and?
Sure. There you go. Okay.
Sorry, I just got that.
Yeah, I should have added that, yes, you also had 2.5 billion gallons a day of the river's water that was being sucked into the intake for the cooling of Indian Point, and that was discharging the water 90 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And okay, so let's go on.
Okay, can I just show 3 for a minute, because I could see that Barbara was straining to look at this.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? Okay, Barbara was really straining to see that. At least it looked that way to me.
All right, keep going. Yeah.
Okay, so then we'll go back to.
So
7.
let's get into the underground plume. Okay, so we're going back to radioactivity. So for every single point in its entire fuel cycle, in addition to emitting carbon-14 during certain parts and using a lot of fossil fuel for energy, you have actual radioactive leaks. And this is a NRC visual of essentially a reservoir of radioactivity underneath Indian Point at the site. And a lot of these leaks came from a lot of different areas of the plant. Some of them them had continued for over a decade before they were identified. One of the major leaks that included strontium was discovered when a contract worker personal monitoring system went off when he was sort of on his boots swashing around outside. And it just gives you just a sense of probably what's happening at a lot of nuclear power sites that aren't nobody even knows about, even though the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has acknowledged that there have been unintended leaks at virtually every single nuclear power site in the country. This radioactivity, by the way, is just draining into the Hudson River because it's underneath the plant site. There's no way to get to it. There's no way to remediate it. And it's just, and every single nuclear power plant has to be by a body of water, mostly lakes, rivers, or the ocean. There's some that are by man-made ponds, but so these kinds of leaks are going in continually, and that's in addition to the day-to-day, like the plume that we saw before, where you have just part of the regular cooling cycle. You have radioactivity being pumped out into the water. You also have radioactivity being pumped out by the stacks of the plant. And that includes carbon-14, which Cindy had mentioned briefly, but let me just elaborate on carbon-14 for a minute. Carbon-14 is carbon. So carbon is exactly what we do not want with climate change, right? It has a half-life of 5,700 years, which means it's dangerous and hazardous, as well as being a greenhouse gas for a very long period of time. And this new carbon-14 that's being pumped out by nuclear is carbon-14 that didn't exist in nature. It's man-made carbon-14. So unlike carbon that's released in fossil fuels, which is the release of sequestered carbon from dinosaurs and ancient plant life, the carbon-14 that's coming out is changing the whole atmospheric, the ecosystem of our entire Earth ratio of carbon-14, and then nobody's really paying attention to what that in and of itself means. And I don't know, but we certainly know that more carbon-14 isn't good. Let's just go to the last slide, and then I'll just ramble on without the slides. This I just have to throw in. When I first showed this to Catherine, she thought it was a joke, but it's not. This is a perfect example of the kind of nonsense that's put out by the nuclear industry front groups, and they are proliferating madly. They pop out with so many different names, it's hard to even keep, like the record of all of them, because once they get exposed, then they just change their name. But this one is the Mothers for Nuclear, right? This group is Mothers for Nuclear. And then so you see the little, this is their logo. I did not make this up. This is what they come up with. And certainly, you have to wonder, like, what mother, we just had Mother's Day, who among us that aren't moms who would not have wished to have their infants bathed in radiation? I mean, it's silly, but this is what's being put out there. Okay, so you can get rid of the slides and I'll just talk.
Okay. Okay.
So how much more time do you think I have to leave for questions?
I'd say take up to 5 minutes, and then we'll have, yeah.
Okay.
Is that good? Is that good?
That is good. I just want to sort of go back to the one point that was raised earlier, but elucidated a bit. With the REM-MAN standard for radioactivity, that came out of the Manhattan Project, because who were the people who were exposed that the government, was trying to protect a little bit? They were young, white 1940 and 1950. And so you were talking about, I think it was 160-pound Caucasian man in his 20s. Okay, so you know, upon reflection, you might realize that doesn't represent the entire population of the human species, right? But the other aspect of the standard is it essentially was a standard focused and has been perpetuated by two disciplines, which are physics and engineering. And it's a very, very mathematical model, because what and this sort of goes into the physics and engineering mindset. And we like our physicists and engineers, right? We need them, we love them. But they have very mathematically oriented brains. And they're not physicians, and they're not biologists, and they're not environmental scientists, and they're certainly not any of the vast number of subdisciplines within medicine and biology and environmental scientists. And therein lies the rub with the entire protective model. It's stupid. That's the scientific term for it. It has no applicability to actually the way a human being, or the way all other living things, or the way the environmental ecosystem works, which are all very, very complex and interactive, and it has been very willfully continued as an area of ignorance not to investigate the broader real world effects of radioactivity. And this works for the fossil fuel industry, and it works for other chemical industries in other contexts, by the way. And it certainly works for the nuclear industry, which, going back to the issue of the Manhattan Project morphed into what the Cold War, right? And the perpetuation of military applications for nuclear. Nuclear power was a sort of a product of almost a split within the Manhattan Project community, which had tens of thousands of people, right? So you had certain groups of these scientists who were actually very legitimately concerned about the rise of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the fact that the Soviet Union was also going full steam ahead in developing atomic weapons, and wanted to, for defense purposes, have a robust atomic bomb program. And you had another group of the Manhattan Project scientists who basically looked at what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and said, oh my God, we have created this unleashed a horror. How can we take it and make something good out of it? And oh, we can turn it into power, this huge amount of power. Let's take it and make it something good that can benefit humanity. So there was really this idealistic strain, and I think it still runs through the field. And I think something we all have to be charitable about is realization that a lot of times people who promote nuclear really just don't understand, a lot of the aspects of it that those of us who sort of labor in the dungeons of the area do. And to understand the issues that are related to nuclear and that relate to radiation, it requires a very, very interdisciplinary perspective. And unfortunately, the way our scientific system is financed, and the way the disciplines sort of have structured themselves because of the complexity of different disciplines, you tend to have a lot of siloing. You know, so the engineers know nothing about the medicine, the doctors know nothing about environmental justice, the people who engage in emergency response don't know anything about the economics, the atmospheric scientists don't know anything except about greenhouse gas emissions that they're told, you know, are coming out of nuclear. And a lot of the confusion, I think, derives from that problem. And I will shut up now.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. There's so much there. And in addition to the radiation, we got a bit of history of how this all came about, which I think adds to our understanding and appreciation of it as well. Thank you very much. So the speaker said that each of us would take 2 minutes after we have our questions. We're going to have about 20 minutes of audience Q&A. So I haven't looked at the chat recently, so I have a bunch of questions if we don't have that. So let me see, can I see the questions here? Let's see. Cindy, would you see any questions there that you find would be of interest?
Well, I believe it was Weston Wilson, might be, well, Weston Wilson asked a question that I did answer in chat.
Okay.
Yeah, regarding what effluent pathway might be causing childhood leukemias. And I answered it in the chat. What we have the most reliable evidence for the association between exposure to radioactivity in regularly operating nuclear reactors and the effluent pathway is pathway to air. But I hesitate to say that that's the only potential pathway. I mean, we all use water. And so it might just be that they're not exactly looking at water effluent like they are air. I think water might be a bit harder to pin down in some ways than air. So I would caution that just because it's not included so much in the studies, the water pathway should not be forgotten. Plus, when you expel something out into the air, it's going to eventually land on the water. So there's that.
Okay. Let's see. So there are quite a few questions here. And Linda Gunter says, thank you. She gave an excellent presentation herself a little while back. Let's see, Mothers for Nuclear are very active on Twitter. Whoa. So they're talking about more information. That's not really a question here. Would any of you like to answer the question of, do you think Japan will actually dump those thousands of tons hundreds of tons anyway, radiated water into the Pacific Ocean? Do you think this is something that might happen or will happen?
I can take that if you want.
Pardon?
I can take that if you want.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Michelle. Yeah.
Well, that Japan's government wants to, and the TEPCO, the operator of the plant. What happened in Japan, and let me digress before I talk about Japan, is we have similar mini versions of that going on at Indian Point and other closed reactor sites. Right. Because when the spent fuel pools where the high level radioactive spent fuel is kept during the reactor operation before it's put into dry cask storage. Right. Once the pools are empty, you have these pools full of really, really very highly contaminated radioactive water, and you can't get all the radioactivity out of it, particularly tritium, because tritiated water is water, so you can't get the radioactive isotope that's water out of water. So right now it's actually an issue of great confrontation between environmental groups and fishermen and other residences of communities of shut reactors. For instance, it's going to be happening at Indian Point. This is a battle that's gearing up now because Indian Point is undergoing decommissioning. but right ahead of us was Pilgrim in Massachusetts, because Holtec, who's undertaking the decommissioning of Pilgrim and as well as of Indian Point and several other reactors, wants to dump the radioactive water into Cape Cod Bay. And of course, Cape Cod, tourists are just going to flock to a bay and get their, clam baked with now a little extra spice of radioactivity. So you can imagine that the seafood fishermen are up in arms about this. Public officials are, citizens of that group. That's happening right now. At Indian Point, it's an upcoming battle. And just one thing I really neglected to say during my presentation, I just want to add, Holtec is also an organization. It's a Holtec International. It sounds very fancy. It's basically a shell company that has no transparency. It's privately owned, and it's going after decommissioning of multiple sites all at the same time. And it's never decommissioned a single nuclear power plant. More than that, it wants to open up a huge, massive waste site for the high-level nuclear waste in New Mexico, of course, in an environmental justice area, minority area. This is their the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's, my show and tell, environmental impact statement on the New Mexico site. This is what the NRC decided from that. Not one single doctor involved in writing that in the. But basically, they decided that all the waste, just thousands and thousands of tons, can go to this poor community. And the reason why it's not a problem, I swear this is what their logic is that because in the same area, which is the Permian Basin, there's so much fossil fuel activity. You have thousands of gas well, oil wells. You also have heavy potash mining. You also have all the uranium mining in New Mexico. Because there's so much radiation and other, out there already, the addition of more radiation is small compared to all this huge radiation. So it's okay. So therefore, the impact of this huge radioactive waste dump is not large, it's small. I mean, so you have to really get your mind around that, but that is the mentality of the industry.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. Unbelievable. I have a brief announcement and another comment. Kate Brown, an MIT professor, will be the NEIS speaker on Night with the Experts, Thursday, May 26th, 7 p.m. Central Time. That's David Kraft's Zoom room. I guess if somebody could put that, his NEIS, I think it's .org. Is that what it is, Michelle? Do you know? Anyway, okay, here's the announcement I want to make. Elizabeth R., you asked about Chernobyl. Tim Mousseau at the University of South Carolina has done a great deal of work at both Chernobyl and Fukushima. At Chernobyl, he and his colleagues found a 50% reduction in bird species and populations, and also found cumulative genetic defects in voles. They have a fast reproduction rate and can be monitored. So that just gives you somewhat of an idea of the long-lasting or some long-lasting possibilities of radiation. Let's see. Does any panelist have a question they would like to ask of another panelist?
I do.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I'd like to ask our two real experts here. All of this is being done, both the nuclear power plants, the fracking, et cetera, coal, it's all being done to boil water. So the idea of going forward and using renewable energy, do you think we can get there?
Cindy, since I talked so much, do you want to take it or would you rather me?
When you say get there, Barbara, do you mean be able to use renewable energy rather than nuclear? Is that what you mean?
Nuclear, fossil fuel of any sort.
Okay.
So I can speak really quickly to what I know, which is Paul Gunter and I had collaborated on a piece where we looked at the IPCC 2022 report, which recently came out. There's a great graph there that I think for nuclear power says all that you need to know. And what that graph shows is that for both efficiency, in other words, coming online in a timely fashion to address the climate crisis, and also cost, nuclear power is blown out of the water by wind and solar, right? And that's in graph form. It's a really good graph. We have it up on Beyond Nuclear's website. You probably have to search for it now because I think it's cycled off. But I would want to point everyone to that graph that shows that, yes, it can be accomplished. Now, you can talk within that about how and where and all of the details, but this IPCC report looked at a lot of different references, and this is what it came up with. And it was kind of refreshing because I don't think that the IPCC has sort of dissed nuclear like this, like they did in this most recent report. It's the 2022 report. And it was very telling because I attended by Zoom an NEA meeting, which is the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is affiliated somehow with the UN. I'm not exactly sure. OECD, right? And they were all about how promising nuclear is, et cetera, but they weren't referencing the IPCC 2022 report at all, which tells you that they don't want to know what it has to say, as far as I can tell. So this graph is great. That's all I have to say about it.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And you mentioned Paul Gunter, and Linda Gunter is sending us a message to panelists and attendees. It's very hard to get fully verifiable information out of Ukraine, Russia, but there are certain reports coming back that some Russian soldiers were taken to a center in Gomel, Belarus, to be treated for their exposures. I think some of those soldiers stayed at the Chernobyl site for about a month. And some of them were sleeping in ditches nearby or some different things I heard. So that's just kind of a message for them. But it's so good to hear that, Cindy, that they are denying or not affirming that nuclear is a possible answer to the climate crisis. That is gone out of the picture. From IPCC.
Can you send a link? Cindy, could you send a link?
Linda posted it in the chat.
Oh, super. Excellent.
Can I also say Beyond Nuclear site also has some article abstracts or like a summary of some of the articles by Amory Lovins, who's a physicist who has done some excellent work. And you know, his basic thesis from the economics point of view is that you have nuclear costs have gone that way straight on through the inception of the era till now, and the other direction of the graph is renewables and battery also, and efficiency, all of which are going steadily down in cost. So dollar for dollar, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck going through a combination of renewables, battery, efficiency, demand side response. You know, it's just from a point of view of money. You know, even if you put aside radioactivity and public health and weapons use and everything else that are all the other negatives associated with nuclear, the economics don't make sense at this point. The industry can't go another day without getting tons and tons of subsidies, which is really what the whole big PR push is about. It's not about allowing nuclear to continue. Nobody's saying nuclear can't continue. Nuclear isn't competitive anymore. It's certainly not competitive with even gas now because gas has been spiking, right? And it hasn't been competitive with renewables for quite some time.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Weston would like to know, Ms. Folkers, what is the pathway that results in higher childhood cancers near nuclear power plants?
Right, I answered that in the chat, and I think I also answered it when I spoke. But what I'll do instead is point to how important it is, not just for deciding energy sources for climate crisis mitigation, right? Which it is important, but it is also important in how we deal with the waste products that are left in determining who is most susceptible. And so Michelle mentioned in her presentation that we have regulations that are supposed to be protective of public health, but they're mostly based on a character called reference man, who's, 20 to 35 years old or something, 70 kilograms in weight, 5'7", which she said doesn't represent most of us. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because something that I didn't talk about in my presentation is myself and Mary Olson of Gender and Radiation Impact Project are collaborating on a model called Reference Girl, which would take into account females' extra sensitivity and also children's extra sensitivity to radiation exposure, and would be a touchstone for understanding what the damage is for not only a female child, but a female child in the areas within communities that live more off the land, right? So like Native Americans and First Nations, and the uranium mining issue, for instance. And so that's something that I wanted to bring up with people to give you guys an idea of how we're moving forward. And while it may or may not be useful, depending on what happens with nuclear energy in the next decade or so, to have a reference like this, it would be very useful for any of the quote unquote disposal or storage options that might be out there for, the hundreds and thousands of years that it's going to take to deal with what's left. So I just wanted to bring that up and let folks know that that's what Mary and I are collaborating on. And we are currently working on that. Not even necessarily for regulatory presentation right away, but really to raise awareness of exactly who and what we are sacrificing for nuclear tech and nuclear waste.
Thank you, Cindy.
Can I just
Stephen
pipe
here
in?
said he's going to have his students watch this in the summer. And since is being recorded, it will be on the Sierra Club New York City group website. And if I have your address or whatever, I'll save the chat. I can send the recording to you, but it will be posted on the Sierra Club New York City group website. Thank you very much, Cindy. I think we can take one more question. But Michelle, you have some accolades here for your presentation. This is really an excellent.
Can I pipe in one thing?
Oh, go
just
ahead, please do.
thing?
Please do, Michelle.
So years before I got involved in this whole area after 9/11, I subconsciously got involved, but I didn't know it yet. I had been part of a State Department exchange program in the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, 1979, 1980. And I went back, I wanted to go back during Perestroika. So I did. So in 1989, I went back, and it was amazing. It was just, the whole atmosphere was so unbelievably different. But I had one image that just stayed with me so powerfully. And I didn't even know what to make of it at the time, because I wasn't thinking of Chernobyl. But so this is 1989. And one of the shopkeepers that I spoke with was going on and on about like how great everything is with Perestroika, and she was going, and we can get chicken and we can get sugar and this and that. And it was this little babushka woman, like with the scarf and everything. And then so she's all happy, and then her face just totally clouded over. And she said, but something's wrong with the children. All the children are sick. They just lie around. They don't go out to play. Well, fast forward, and you had in 2009, a monograph, a huge monograph, which compiled thousands of Slavic and other non-English speaking studies from Chernobyl, that was led by the lead author was Alexei Vladimirovich Yablokov, who I met actually. He came to New York for a conference. He was with the Russian Academy of Sciences. And one of the key findings of these studies that they were doing were how many other illnesses besides cancer they were finding in all age populations, but basically how children were just sick. That you had areas where were in these contaminated areas of Russia where children before, where you had healthy children, most of the children were healthy, and then over the years, so many were sick. And one of the really interesting things that came out from another analysis of another book that was published by one of the officials who became a member of the Politburo during Perestroika, and there was this brief period where things were sort of open, during Yeltsin and a little bit Gorbachev. What she identified, the group of the Politburo that she was involved in, her name is Alla Yaroshinskaya, was that there had been, right after Chernobyl, a whole series of secret protocols. They were called her book on it is called Chernobyl, the Forbidden Truth. And what the Politburo is coming up with the internal memos recording what was actually going on, which included thousands and thousands of people going to hospitals, having radiation sickness, children. But the one that really stuck out to me, which I was going to read before, but I'll read now. This was a secret appendix to point 10 of the secret protocol number 32 of August 22, 1986. It states, and this is the quote, okay? In order to avoid the accumulation of large amounts of radioactive matter in people's bodies as a result of eating contaminated food, the Minister of Health of the USSR recommends distributing the contaminated meat as widely as possible in the country and using it to make sausages, preserved meat, and meat products in a proportion of 1 to 10 with normal meat. So for people who were perplexed by the sudden low level of births that you heard about after the Soviet Union broke up, please, all over the country, not just in the contaminated areas, the food that was contaminated was being spread all over.
It seems to apply everywhere. Dilution is the solution to pollution, but it isn't. It isn't. It just makes the effects go wider. Yeah, pretty horrible. So,
Oh yeah, I think that we have just barely enough time left. Each person was going to give a closing remark and for the webinar. So we'll start with Cindy, Michelle, and then I will go.
and me.
Yeah, Barbara. Right. I thought I said Barbara. I'm so sorry. Okay, so it's Cindy, Michelle, Barbara, and me, because you asked to go last. Okay, thank you.
So me first?
Cindy, go ahead.
Okay.
Closing remarks.
So I guess what I want to say is that narratives surrounding ionizing radiation have often minimized radioactivity's impact on the health of human and non-human animals and the natural environment. Many Cold War research policies, as Michelle had stated, practices and interpretations drove nuclear technology forward by institutionally obscuring the empirical evidence of radiation's disproportionate and low-dose harm. And this is a legacy that we're still dealing with. Women, children, and pregnancy development are particularly sensitive to exposure from radioactivity. They are the most sensitive. They suffer more damage per dose than adult males, even down to small doses, making low doses a cornerstone of concern especially with the increases in environmental contamination. Evidence of compounding generational damage could indicate increased radio sensitivity through heritable impact. There is existing empirical evidence demonstrating these sensitivities, and research institutions and regulatory authorities have devalued them, willingly sacrificing health in the service of maintaining and expanding nuclear tech. Radiation's disproportionate impact should now be the research and policy focus, as our societies are posed to make crucial and long-lasting decisions regarding climate change mitigation, future energy sources, and nuclear waste storage.
Thank you, Cindy. Michelle, then Barbara, and then me. Michelle?
Yeah, I would just like people to reflect on the fact that when we're talking about radiation, we're talking about this cumulative, ever growing amount. Starting with the atomic era and all the weapons complex emissions, now with fracking and the massive amounts of radioactivity coming from fracking that's also being, by the way, spread around, not just in fracking areas. It's the constant, even natural radiation. The industry always likes to say, oh, radiation is natural. It's like daisy dust. Well, you know what? Natural radion is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States, with so tens of thousands of people dying from it every year. So it's like natural radiation has a little bit of a problem too. But every exposure is added to other exposures. And exposures from the earliest bombs are still out there. We are still exposed to many of the radionuclides that were unleashed in the 1940s and 50s and 60s during bomb testing and certainly during the actual use of the bombs. And as Barbara pointed out, and I'll go into Barbara, let's lead this into Barbara, you're talking about these toxic hazardous materials and chemicals that are just being pumped out. Nobody knows what the interactions synergistically are, but we are seeing rising numbers of cancer, rising numbers of childhood cancer, rising numbers of developmental disabilities, rising numbers of immune disorders, rising numbers of neuroendocrine immune disorders. And instead of worrying about whether the poison comes from gas or oil or nuclear or something, why don't we just reduce it all as much as possible?
Thank you, Michelle. Barbara?
Okay, we must all remember, however depressing all this sounds, that we have the power to take ourselves and our world in better directions for today and certainly for the future. Yes, fossil fuel use must decline. We are already seeing severe climate warming, damages, extinctions, weather disasters, etc. We can and must have the will to move to a renewable future by incorporating much greater energy efficiency combined with advances in renewable technology and energy storage that will bring us there. I have been accused of being NIMBY, not in my backyard, and I say yes. Not only is that a personal point of strength to speak from my home, but also I consider the planet to be my backyard. We don't have another. And one more thought, make sure you vote. Elections have consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I just want to say one or two things before I go into what I really wanted to say, and that is, you may have heard a lot about SMRs, small molecular reactors. I'm sorry, small modular reactors. And a lot of people seem to be thinking that this is the answer. And I just want you to be aware that, and everything we've learned this evening about radiation, that small modular reactors also produce radiation. So there is no real safe nuclear nuclear power plant. But what I want to say is, in addition to looking at our own neighborhoods, I think it would be good for us to look ahead. And we see that we have most of the 90-some nuclear reactors in this country, nuclear power plants, move into decommissioning. They will be doing that. Some are in the process already. And also decommissioned nuclear power plants may send their nuclear waste to the CIS, Consolidated Interim Storage, mostly in New Mexico and Texas. Send it by truck, barge, train. And we can educate, as we have done this evening, for more public awareness to ensure safety and the prevention of dangerous nuclear travel paths crisscrossing our country with potential moving bombs. But even more than that, and what is even more important to me, is that we have to create, restore racial, environmental justice for the thousands of people and communities in New Mexico and the Midwest who have contracted cancers, who have been poisoned by uranium mining and remains left insufficiently cleaned up, if at all. Most of these people are indigenous, Navajo, Dene, other indigenous tribes, Black, brown, Hispanic, and poor. And to me, I don't know if this is an appropriate word to use, but I find it obscene that these people have not been taken care of properly, that their sites have not been cleaned up, and so many other things. So as we're thinking of the dangers of radiation, please, please think of the people, not only in our country, but in Uzbekistan and Nigeria, all around the world, who have been suffering from radiation. So we have a big job to do, not only educate each other and what we can do. And I have learned so much from all of you tonight. Barbara, Cindy, Michelle, thank you so much for what you have taught us this evening. So not only do we think of us in our neighborhoods, but think of our neighborhood, as Barbara said, as the world and all the people we have to help and prevent this from happening for. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Good night. Oh, and one tiny thing, I put the address of our website in the chat. So in a couple days, you can look for this recording. Thanks again, everybody. You're wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, Cindy, Michelle, and all of the attendees. And Regina, who wasn't able to get on. Thank you. Peace. Peace.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Peace.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.